I want to show you some things about Blender that might come in handy for you if you're dealing with a situation such as the one that I'm handling right now. I'm in the midst of doing a remastering job on this film that I made many years ago. And as you can see here, Blender was involved on some scenes, and this is an ancient version of Blender. And that's because I did this back in 2009. And to try to bring it up to date with a new version of Blender, it's just not worth the work. It would take thousands of hours. So we're dealing with an old version of Blender here, but everything that I'm showing you is just as true today as it was back then, I guess, on today's version of Blender as on the old version of Blender. At any rate, this scene that we're looking at now, I've decided in my remastering to change it from color to sepia tone. And by doing that, it changes the lighting. And so here on the bottom half of the screen, we can see that these objects that are on this tabletop, they are the ones in question. They used to be quite easy to see because of especially the saxophone, which is the most important object, the bold color of it. But when you take away the color, suddenly it just almost disappears without an extra light. So I decided to add a light to it, but I didn't want to re-render the entire scene. There's just way too much going on, especially with ray tracing. So I only want to re-render these three objects on the tabletop. But there's a complication. If we look at the top half of the screen, you can see that at this moment, our main character here with his wonderful pink fig leaf is walking right in front of the saxophone. He'll be walking in front of all of the objects, but this is the dramatic thing to show you with the saxophone. So if I re-render that relit saxophone, but I don't want to re-render him when he's walking in front of it, well, then we're in trouble. There's a way to work around this. It's not that complicated, but there's some little fiddly bits about it that I want to show you, especially because I'm also dealing with, if we go back to the bottom half of the screen here, we can see that he's walking towards this funky chair that has this monitor on it. The contents of that monitor, the screen here, I want to keep the color, even though everything else has been changed to sepia. So I'm going to have to re-render that as well. We won't get into that yet, if at all, because by the time I get through with these objects on the table, this becomes quite easy. And the same function applies. At any rate, let's get to it. So, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff in the scene here. And this isn't everything. I'm just showing you a selection of it to just give you an idea of the scene. The majority of this stuff is all on a separate scene, and I'm referencing it. So this scene that we're looking at here is called Getting Up from Couch. So we're going to switch to the scene where those objects are. I called that Assets scene. And there's all these other scenes, many, many more actually than the ones you see here. And they all make reference to the objects. There's Asset scene and Assets in Flux for obvious reasons, I hope. So if we go to the Asset scene, we can see that there's more. There's windows and all these other things that are going on. And the saxophone has disappeared. That's because that's one of the assets in flux, because our character is going to be picking it up and playing it. Not that that matters right now, but I just want to show you that we're dealing with objects from here that are in this scene, and I've got things highlighted, and you can see here that with the layers, that layer 2 is the one that's got stuff going on. And when we go to Assets in Flux, now we can see this because it's going to be moving around and whatnot. It's like, okay, where did the saxophone go? Well, it's probably because I don't have that layer showing. So you can see, there it is. There's our saxophone. So these objects were on other layers before, but I've moved them to layer 2. And so now, when we go back to getting up from couch, which is where we began, now you can see that here's the saxophone. It's on layer 2. These other objects that are not selectable because they're from the assets scene and not assets in flux, we won't get into that, but everything's on layer 2. And when we click on our hero, we can see that he's on layer 3. And the reason that I moved those other objects to the other layer, to layer 2, is specifically because we're going to be taking advantage of multiple layers for our little trick here. Now we've got 2 layers that I'm actually dealing with here. These are render layers as opposed to visibility layers, or whatever you want to call this difference. It's been too many years since I dealt with the minutiae of this naming problem, but it doesn't matter. You know what I'm trying to say, right? So here we can see the scene layers versus the layers that are included in this render layer. So we've got 2 render layers, and only one of them is selected for actual rendering. And that's this one that I called overlay. And that's the objects that we're going to be re-rendering with the extra light. So what I've done is by putting those on layer 2, which is the only one that we're going to render, as you can see here, but I've got layer 3 selected as a mask layer. And so that's the key here, is that he's on layer 3, right? When I select him, you can see that layer 3 is the one that lights up. And if I select the saxophone, which is selectable because it was on that assets in flux scene, now we can see that layer 2 has lit up. So the things that we want to render, these 3 things, are all on layer 2. So by telling it to use layer 3 as the mask layer, that means that even though we're not going to be rendering him, we are going to be masking using him so that it's going to block what's behind. And that's the key, right? So with all of that said now, all I have to do is hit F12, and we'll just wait a few seconds. This is the old CPU-based rendering. Another thing I'm doing to speed up the process is I'm only rendering this small section because I'm only interested in those 3 objects. And so as you can see now, here's the saxophone, and it's got this part that's blacked out. And it's not actually black, but it's kind of black. That's his silhouette. If I switch to the camera scene, the camera view down here in the bottom window, there. So now you can see there's the saxophone with this part cut out. There's his nose and his chin and everything. And there, if we go up here, you can see, there it is. And so now that frame is ready to go. We just have to make sure that when we are outputting it, that we're using something with RGBA. So I'm using PNG, and now instead of just the default RGB, we're going to select RGBA. And that way it's going to, oh, and the other thing to do is to make sure that your alpha, instead of being sky, which you can use if you're going to do some trickery, and then you don't even need to use RGBA. You could just use RGB, but that's going to be more work to do it after the fact, to create an alpha channel afterwards. It's better to do it right now while you're rendering. So choose something that gives you the A for alpha channel, and then set your alpha to either straight alpha or pre-multiplied. If you're doing alpha channel, you'll know what I'm talking about and why you should use one or the other. Pre-multiplied is the better choice, obviously, depending on what you're doing and what you're using for your post-processing. At any rate, so that's it. Now we're ready to go for that. I've simplified things, but these are the most important things to keep in mind. And as I said, the same thing applied for the monitor. This actually went a lot faster than I thought it would. Not bad. But at any rate, so it's the same thing with the monitor. If you have a scene where he's walking and standing right in front of it, then you're going to have this problem. You can't just do this afterwards using your visual editing software or whatever you're using to put everything together so that you could just do an overlay of this. You can do it. In fact, I did for a couple of shots where the camera wasn't moving and nothing ever got in the way, especially if it was straight on, so that if it was, oops, no, that's the right one. I don't know why it didn't come in closer. I think I've just found a little bug here. Not that it matters, because we're talking about a very ancient version of Blender from decades ago. But at any rate, if the shot was kind of like this, then you could easily just make a matte and then overlay the color version onto the sepia version. But same trick, right? Just make sure that the object that you're dealing with is on the appropriate layer. This is not the same scene. In fact, there's something else I could show you about this. I might as well do it since we have enough time, I suppose. In this case, I've already done this in other scenes, but we only want the contents of this screen. We don't want to re-render everything else. And so, as you can see, this is all one object. And so if we go into the edit mode for the object, then we can see that this screen is actually a separate part that I've melded into it. And so if we deselect all the geometry and now just tell it to look at faces down here and then select the face, let's see how lucky I am with my click. Nope. There's a lot of stuff going on behind there. At any rate, let's try it from here and see if I can get it. Yep, I got it. Okay. So now all I have to do is separate that into its own object. And that way it becomes very easy. And then we just put that onto layer 3 so that we can use this same setup here by using that as our mask and blah, blah, blah. Then not layer 3, layer 2. Everything else is going to be on 3. See what I'm saying? So that's something else to keep in mind when you're dealing with, and the reason that I was thinking about that in particular is because there's a scene where this chair rotates. And so the screen is not visible, and then when it rotates, it becomes visible, and it's being obscured by itself. And so we need to be able to separate that. And that's how we wind up with the chair as one object and the contents of the screen as another. Oh, and one other thing to keep in mind is when you separate out that plane, because that's all this is when we remove it, is this one face is just a vertical plane. Make sure that you delete the other one, because you're going to wind up with both of them sharing the same space at the same time, and you're going to get Z fighting and just lots of problems. So be sure to not just duplicate, but delete the original at the same time. So that's something else to keep in mind. And on that note, I think that's really all that you need to know. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I don't think I forgot anything. And maybe by the time you see this, you'll be able to see the remastered version of the film on this same channel. Maybe I'll actually have a separate clip just showing this scene once I've got it up. All right, have fun.